Konami has printed much support to try and tie normal traps together throughout the years, including a universal searcher for them in Trap Trick. And in this video, we'll be going over the absolute best generic normal traps you can set from your deck with this card. And at number 10, we have Compulsory Evacuation Device. This trap lets you target a monster in the field and bounce it back to the hand. This is probably one of the oldest cards around that has seen play almost ever since it came out, to the point where the act of returning a monster back to the hand is often called a compulse. It's just an all-around great piece of costless one-for-one removal. At first, this was seen as a pure tempo card, since bouncing back matched up really badly against tons of monsters in the early metas, such as monarchs and gadgets, as they can just get off their summon effects again. This meant for a good while, this card would be passed up for alternatives like Raigeki Break and Phoenix Wing Wind Blast. Compulse would become much better at the introduction of synchros, since bouncing those don't make you go minus. While extra deck monsters were a thing before, they wouldn't start becoming widespread up until this point. Compulse also happened to match up extremely well against one of the most popular first wave synchros, Stardust Dragon, because it could negate destruction effects by tributing itself. This kind of chainable non-destruct removal became so much more powerful with time that by the XYZ era, Konami felt the need to actually limit this card, and they wouldn't unhit the card until after a good half decade or so later. Nowadays, Compulsory Evacuation Device is still a very good option that's always played in all sorts of trap decks. It's a bit worse off due to how widespread targeting protection can be these days, but it makes up for being able to bypass the insane floating effects we have in the meta right now. It also has a very good interaction with one of the best partners for back row decks these days, Lord of the Heavenly Prison, because you can bounce it back to your hand to reuse its effect to protect your traps and set any spell or trap from the deck. And coming in at number 9, we have Boo Boo Game. This card's effect is that during damage calculation, if a monster battles, you take no damage from that battle. Additionally, if this card is destroyed by opponent's card effect and sent to the graveyard, it lets you target 2 normal trap cards in your graveyard, except other copies of itself, and set them back to your field. And both of these cards can be activated this turn. Boo Boo Game came out more recently as a way to punish your opponent for blindly popping your back row, kinda like Waking the Dragon. Now, there's some pros and cons to using either of those, and this spot could have easily been occupied by either, but Boo Boo Game has simply matched up better with most of the recently released normal trap-reliant decks. While Waking the Dragon can bring out a game-ending threat as Nature Exterio and the Last Warrior from Another Planet, it doesn't play well with back row decks that lock themselves somehow. For example, both Eldritch and Labyrinth have chainable back row that can use in response to mass removal, but if they do so, they'll be locked into zombies and fiends respectively. This is where Boo Boo Game comes in, since it can just bring your interactions back from the graveyard. Having your normal traps still be usable is way more important for Labyrinth as well, since you need your normal traps to resolve to advance your game plan. A good way to use this card is to chain either Trap Trick or another normal trap and Lady of Labyrinth's effects to set Boo Boo Game from the deck in response to something like a Harpy's Feather Duster. This way at least you won't be losing all of your interaction off of a single blowout, even if you'll be limited to flipping only one of them that turn if you use Trap Trick. Now at number 8, we have Destructive Daruma Karma Cannon. This normal trap changes as many monsters in the field as possible to face down defense position, and then if either player controls a face-up monster afterwards, they must send all face-up monsters they control to the graveyard. This card is a very recent TCG exclusive, and one of the best normal traps in recent memory. Daruma Cannon's Mass Book of Moon effect is really hard to play around, as very few decks are going to be able to keep going after having their whole field flip face down. Additionally, this card will also send all Link monsters, as well as monsters that weren't affected by its effects, to the graveyard afterwards. Since this card is worded like evenly matched, it doesn't matter which kind of protection their monsters have, since it's affecting the player and not the cards themselves. Though, for that same reason, this means this card doesn't go very well with one of the most popular normal trap decks right now, Labyrinth, since this won't trigger their effects when monsters are removed from the field by trap effects. However, on the other hand, this card actually goes quite well with Eldritch, because Daruma Cannon will set back Conquistador and Hakero back to the spell and trap card zone, letting you reuse their effects again on the following turn. This is a very nice tool for almost any kind of control deck which doesn't end on monster interruptions, and is probably only second to dealing with a field full of monsters in the number 1 spot on this list. Daruma hasn't seen much play yet, outside of some experimentation as a going first trap to put in, but it doesn't have a nice home yet and is often outclassed by other similar options. And at number 7, we have Metaverse. This trap lets you take one field spell from your deck and either activate it or add it to your hand. This card wasn't usable with trap tricks for the longest time now, since it had gone to 1 due to Mystic Mine. Metaverse for mine was one of the nastiest things to be hit with back when it was still legal. Not only was it turn ending, but also possibly game ending if you didn't have an out in your deck. So this was a staple in every mine deck, such as Sky Striker and Altergeist. While this card does lose a huge deal of its power with Mine Ban, there are still tons of applications for this card, and it can finally be worth a running field spell specifically for it now that we have it at 3. They might not be as good as Mystic Mine was, but there are still tons of really nasty field spell floodgates. There is Necro Valley to lock up any and all kinds of graveyard strategies, which is a very good portion of the decks these days. Zombie World locks up decks that rely on tribute summoning, or just having specific monster types. If your deck plays any spellcaster monsters, you can even use Secret Village of the Spellcasters to lock your opponent out of using spell cards. There's also tons of niche options, and it can also be used to get into your engine depending on what you're running. Metaverse is unique due to the amount of utility it can give you against a wide array of matchups off of a single card. As long as you're willing to put enough field spells in your side deck, you probably won't find a single trap that can hit such a wide array of decks simultaneously as this one. And at number 6, we have Eradicator Epidemic Virus. This card requires you to tribute a 2500 attack or higher dark monster as cost, and then you declare either spell or traps. Following this, you get to look at your opponent's hand and all their back row and all cards they draw until their third turn after this card's activation, and destroy all cards of that type. Eradicator is an absolute blowout of a card, which is only somewhat limited by its somewhat restrictive tribute costs. This card is often used as a side deck option to back up combo boards. Since almost all great going second cards are spells, blindly calling it during the draw phase can often erase your opponent's chance of winning completely. This card also has some extra utility back when Mystic Mine was legal too, since it was also an out for it. Eradicator has recently become much more accessible due to the release of Gigantic Sprite, a Dark Xyz that can also be made with Link 2s and reaches 3200 attack if it has an extra deck monster underneath. Gigantic enables basically every deck with a level 2 to get into an Eradicator body easily, even through hand traps most of the time. Tier specifically had such an easy time getting to it that one of the most popular variants of the deck from back when it had first come out, Danger Tier, went for Eradicator set with Nightmare Griffin as part of the regular end board. This card also has a counterpart for 1500 attack or less monsters instead, with a slightly easier activation requirement in Deck Devastation Virus. These two made up a somewhat popular package in some side decks, consisting of 2 Trap Tricks, 2 Deck Devs, and 2 Eradicators for going first, letting you have 4 copies of the best viruses for any given matchup. Though this hasn't been very popular as of late due to the way the current metagame has shaped up to be. And coming in at number 5, we have Ice Dragon's Prison. This card can target a monster in your opponent's graveyard and then special summon it to your side of the field with its effects negated. Then you can banish one monster from both players' fields that have the same type as each other. Ice Dragon's Prison is one of the most flexible normal traps around. By targeting a monster from your opponent's graveyard with the same type as one they have on the field, you get access to non-targeting, non-destruction removal. This card is especially good at dealing with mono-type decks, of course, even if it's not really that outlandish for any given deck to fulfill its activation condition at some point through their turn. Now, what makes IDP particularly nasty is how likely it is to get a 2-for-1 when an opponent plays into it, since you can use it to both stop a graveyard effect and remove a threat at the same time. Ice Dragon's Prison is so powerful that during some formats, people would play it as a going first card in their side decks over blowouts like Solemn and Anti-Spell Fragrance. There's even utility in being able to simply steal your opponent's monsters from the graveyard even with its effect negated, as you can use it for link plays during your turn, or to just push for lethal, something which trap decks tend to struggle with. The card is in somewhat of an unfortunate state right now though, as it matches up really poorly against the Ishizu Shufflers since they can make the effect whiff. Still, if this card does resolve, it can decide the game by itself, which is more or less the expected power of a generic normal trap nowadays. Even if the conditions might not be appropriate for this card right now, it's still good enough to at least be considered in almost any trap deck anyways. And at number 4, we have Dogmatika Punishment. This card lets you target a face-up monster your opponent controls, and then send a monster with equal or higher attack from your X deck to the graveyard to destroy it. Then, until the end of the turn after this card resolves, you cannot special summon from the extra deck. Punishment does have an extremely heavy restriction, but it more than makes up for being the most versatile piece of removal around. It also enables trap decks that either end on an extra deck monster, or don't need their normal summon to play a small Dogmatika engine to search it out. There are many other chainable traps that trade 1 for 1. But being able to foolish a monster from the extra grants this card a ton of extra utility. The most common send is usually Elder Entity into Tis, as it will just always use its graveyard effect to pop yet another card on resolution. Though there is also Wind Pegasus at Ignister, which gives you a spin if your opponent destroys a card you control. Or Mirror Logic Aggregator, which lets you target and negate a card in the field with its graveyard effect. And at last, a TCG exclusive Garura, which gives you an easy +1 when it hits the grave. Not unlike the previous on this list, this card is extremely powerful in the right circumstances, but can match up extremely badly depending on which decks people are playing. For example, right now, you really don't want to be popping any of the monsters the best decks play, as they all have really powerful graveyard effects. Even so, this card still makes this list in a fairly high spot as the most reliable way to get a 2-for-1 through a normal trap in the game. And at number 3, we have Dimensional Barrier. This card lets you declare a monster type, that being either Ritual, Fusion, Synchro, Xyz, or Pendulum. And for the rest of the turn, it negates the effects of that monster type and also prevents your opponent from special summoning monsters of that type. D-Barrier is one of the strongest floodgates available in the game at the moment, and the only reason why it's not overwhelmingly powerful is that it was printed before Link monsters, and so it does not allow you to declare that type. This card is basically impossible to play around or counter if your opponent gets it in their opening hand, and gives you a lingering turn-skipping effect against a lot of decks, At least with continuous floodgates, you can hope to draw into back row removal, but there's nothing you can do once a D barrier resolves. This card's effect in the meta was especially aggravating a few formats ago when Sword Soul and Despia were the best decks of the format, since both of these decks lost pretty hard to this card as they played almost exclusively synchros and fusions respectively. It was a card that was present in every single side deck, and would lead to a lot of non-games post-siding. Many times you were just hoping to draw into your 1-copy red reboot when going second to beat it, and you'd often have to side the card even against decks that didn't play any other traps due to the possibility of barrier. Things were so bad that some even opted to play Crossout Designator together with a single copy of the card to have a better shot at beating it going second. Either way, this card's ability to just shut down turns with no counterplay even led to people calling for it to be banned just a few months ago. Every time there's a format where the top decks are using one summoning mechanic that's not links, you can be sure this card will be in every deck list in some capacity. And at number 2, we have Artifact Sanctum. This card special summons an artifact monster from your deck, but you cannot conduct your battle phase the turn you activate the effect. Also, if it's destroyed by an opponent's card effect, you get to target and destroy a card in the field. Sanctum changed the game like few other traps did back when the card first came out. Back then, it was used to bring out Artifact Moral Touch from the deck, which lets you pop a card on summon on top of being a level 5 body on top of that. The Artifact engine was played in almost every control deck of the time, as there were very few ways to play around it. You'd almost always be going at least +1 off of activation. The fact that all of the artifact cards punish your opponent somehow when they're popped rendered most back row removal useless, as this was back when Mystical Space Typhoon was your best generic card for that too. This even led to Moral Touch being limited for a while, though people kept splashing Sanctum into many decks still anyways. In modern times, this card is played as an easy way to skip your opponent's turn with what was one of the least used artifacts back then, Scythe. When Scythe is special summoned during your opponent's turn, it locks your opponent from special summoning from the extra deck for the rest of the turn. While skipping a turn like this wasn't such a big deal in 2015, nowadays that means you almost 100% lose the game on turn 3. Even if you do have an out to Sanctum, if your opponent did anything meaningful during their turn, they will probably also have an out to your out. A few formats ago, when Dimensional Barrier fell out of favor, it simply gave way for Sanctum to be played. It does require you to play a brick in your main deck, and it does have more outs than Barrier, but it makes up for being able to stop any kind of deck instead. And finally, at number 1, we have Torrential Tribute. This trap card can be active when a monster is summoned and destroys all monsters on the field. It's amazing how good Torrential still is, despite being one of the oldest trap cards around. This card has seen play all the way back since 2003, and they still haven't printed a normal trap that does what Torrential does. This card was a staple in basically every single deck for years on end while it was still limited, as one of the best ways to punish your opponent for overextending. It only got better as more and more graveyard effects were put into the game as well, since torrentialing away your own field or shadows or BAs will make you plus enough to make up for the loss of field presence. While this card has fallen off enough to not be used in every deck anymore, and to be allowed at 3, that doesn't mean it isn't one of the most formidable interactions around anymore. Its effect will often leave you at a massive advantage if it's timed right, and many times there's just no way to play around it when staring down back row. This card is made even nastier by the fact that almost every single trap deck has some way to summon out monsters during your opponent's turn, letting you trigger Torrential at your own leisure. This card also happens to be one of the best trap cards when staring down a board when going second as well, since any summon your opponent makes to try to go for game can trigger Torrential to set them back to square one. Torrential Tribute plus Solemn Strike has long been one of the best way for trap decks to play into a heavy negate board when going second, often letting you break through after setting 5 and passing during your turn. This kind of effect is so sought after that trap decks have also been sometimes willing to play Needle Sealing, basically a strictly worse version of Torrential, just to have an additional shot at field wiping. This card has been in the game for longer than any of the other cards on this list, and yet looks like it's the one that's least likely to be power crept someday. Torrential is probably the first thing to come to mind when anyone thinks about good normal traps, as Konami has yet to print another card as iconic and versatile as this one. That's why it shouldn't be any surprise that it takes number 1 spot on this list. Alright, and that's the list. If you happen to know of any other trap cards or have any ideas for future videos just like this one, please let us know down in the comments below.